The morning fog hung thick over the French hedgerows on June 12, 1940, when Lieutenant Howard Thornton raised his English longbow for the seventh time in 3 days. His commanding officer had called the weapon a relic, a joke, absolutely useless against the Wehrmacht's machine guns and panzers. But through the mist, Thornton could see his seventh target, a German sergeant barking orders at a mortar crew 180 yards away. The other officers didn't understand. They saw an ancient weapon from a forgotten age. Thornton saw the perfect tool for silent killing, for psychological warfare, for proving that sometimes the old ways were deadlier than anything modern. He drew the bowstring back to his cheek, felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the same draw weight that English archers had used to slaughter French knights at Agincourt 5 centuries earlier. The arrow flew. The German sergeant collapsed without a sound, a yard-long shaft buried in his chest. 7 confirmed kills in 72 hours. All with a weapon his fellow officers had mocked as medieval nonsense. See, what you need to understand about the British Army in 1940 is that they were getting their tails kicked across France. The Germans were faster, better coordinated, better equipped. British soldiers were dying by the hundreds, retreating toward the coast, throwing away their rifles just to run faster toward Dunkirk. The entire expeditionary force was collapsing. And in the middle of that disaster, one man was hunting German soldiers with a 6-foot bow and arrows he'd made himself. The same kind of bow that won the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The same kind of weapon the British Army had officially stopped using in 1595, 345 years earlier. Howard Thornton wasn't supposed to be carrying that bow. There was no regulation allowing it, no manual describing how to use it, no supply chain providing arrows. He'd brought it from home, along with 60 arrows he'd crafted in his workshop during the phony war. His battalion commander had told him to leave the damn thing behind. His company commander had threatened him with disciplinary action. His platoon sergeant had flat out said it was the stupidest idea he'd seen in 20 years of service. Thornton didn't care what any of them thought. He'd been the runner-up champion at the British National Archery Championships in 1938. He could put an arrow through a playing card at 60 yards. He could shoot faster than most men could work a bolt-action rifle. And most importantly, he understood something about warfare that the tacticians in London had forgotten while they were studying tank formations and artillery tables. In war, fear matters as much as firepower. A German soldier getting shot by a rifle knew what was happening to him. He'd trained for it, expected it, understood the threat. But a German soldier watching his sergeant drop dead with an arrow in his chest. No gunshot, no warning, just a quiet whistle through the air and then death. That soldier's mind would freeze trying to process what he was seeing. Medieval weapons in a modern war. It didn't make sense. And in combat, confusion kills faster than bullets. The British Expeditionary Force had landed in France in September 1939, expecting to fight a war like the last one. Trenches, artillery duels, infantry charges across no man's land. They got 8 months of sitting around doing nothing while the politicians argued, and the French built more fortifications on the Maginot Line. They called it the phony war. No combat, no casualties, just boredom and training exercises. The Germans spent those same 8 months planning the largest mechanized assault in military history. On May 10, 1940, they invaded France with 141 divisions, 2,500 tanks, and 3,500 aircraft. The Blitzkrieg tore through Allied defenses like they were made of paper. Howard Thornton's battalion, the 2nd Royal Berkshire Regiment, was positioned in northern France as part of the British defensive line. They were experienced soldiers, well-trained, well-disciplined. They got absolutely hammered by the German advance. Within 2 weeks, the entire British line was collapsing. Orders were confused. Communications were breaking down. Units were getting separated from their commanders. The retreat toward Dunkirk had begun, and it was turning into a rout. Thornton was a platoon commander, responsible for 38 men. He'd kept his bow and arrows in his kit during the phony war, practicing when he could, maintaining the weapon, waiting for a chance to prove it could work. His chance came on June 10, 1940, during a rearguard action near the village of Saint-Valery-en-Caux. The battalion was covering the retreat of other units, buying time for thousands of soldiers to reach the evacuation beaches. The Germans were pressing hard, probing the British defenses, looking for weak points to exploit. Thornton's platoon was dug in along a tree line overlooking a road. German patrols were moving through the area, trying to locate British positions. Standard procedure would be to let them pass, stay hidden, avoid giving away defensive positions until absolutely necessary. But Thornton saw an opportunity. A German sergeant was standing in the open, about 150 yards away, studying a map with 2 other soldiers. Exposed, vulnerable, completely unaware he was being watched. Thornton had his Lee Enfield rifle next to him in the foxhole. So did every other man in his platoon. One rifle shot would kill the German, but it would also reveal their position to every enemy soldier within earshot. The Germans would call in mortars or artillery. The British position would be compromised. Men would die. But an arrow made no sound except the whistle of its flight. An arrow left no muzzle flash, no smoke, no evidence of where it came from. An arrow was invisible death. He pulled the longbow from its canvas case and strung it. His men stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Private Mitchell whispered, "Sir, what the hell are you doing?" Thornton didn't answer. He nocked an arrow, drew the bowstring, aimed high to account for the distance and the arrow's arc. The German sergeant was still studying his map, completely focused on the terrain ahead of him. Thornton released. The arrow flew in a high arc, dropped, and punched through the German's chest just below the collarbone. The sergeant collapsed. His 2 companions stood there for 3 full seconds, staring at the arrow sticking out of their leader's body, trying to understand what had just happened. They never figured it out. They ran, screaming warnings about snipers, about hidden positions, about threats they couldn't see. The German patrol fell back in disorder. Thornton's platoon sergeant crawled over to him and said, "I'll be damned, it actually worked." Word spread fast through the battalion. The lieutenant with the bow had killed a German without giving away the platoon's position. Officers who'd mocked the weapon started asking questions. How far could he shoot? How accurate was it? Could he do it again? He did it again the next day. June 11th, 1940. The Germans were conducting a reconnaissance patrol through the same sector, trying to map British defensive positions. Thornton was positioned in a different location, half a mile from his previous hide. He'd moved during the night, knowing that a smart enemy would remember where threats came from and avoid those areas. But they couldn't avoid what they couldn't predict. The second kill happened just after dawn. A German lieutenant was standing on a small rise, using binoculars to scan the British lines. Range approximately 165 yards. Wind from the west at maybe 5 miles per hour. Thornton compensated for both distance and wind, aiming slightly left and high. The arrow took the lieutenant in the throat. He went down choking on his own blood, unable to scream, unable to warn his men. The patrol scattered, firing blindly at shadows, hitting nothing. Thornton and his men stayed silent in their positions. No return fire, no movement. Invisible. Kill number 3 came that same afternoon. A German corporal was directing a machine gun team setting up in a farmhouse window. Thornton spotted them from 180 yards away. The machine gun was a serious threat. If it opened fire on British positions, men would die. Taking it out with rifle fire would require a sustained firefight, but one arrow, one perfect shot, could eliminate the threat before it became operational. Thornton waited until the corporal leaned out of the window to shout instructions to soldiers below. The arrow caught him in the chest, punching through ribs and into his heart. He fell backward into the room. The machine gun team panicked, abandoned their weapon, fled the farmhouse. One shot, one casualty. One enemy crew neutralized without the British firing a single conventional round. By June 12th, the battalion knew they had something special happening. The Germans in their sector were acting differently, more cautious, more paranoid. They weren't advancing as aggressively. They were clustering in groups instead of spreading out properly. They were making tactical mistakes because they were scared. Scared of arrows, scared of silent death, scared of an enemy they couldn't locate or understand. Thornton's fourth kill was a sergeant directing mortar fire. Range, 175 yards. The sergeant was standing in the open, calling coordinates to his mortar crew. Stupid mistake, but it happens in combat. Men get focused on their jobs and forget to stay in cover. Thornton made him pay for that mistake. The arrow hit him high in the back, severing his spine. He collapsed instantly, paralyzed, dying slowly over the next several minutes while his horrified crew tried to figure out what had happened. They never saw where the shot came from. They picked up their sergeant and ran, abandoning the mortar position entirely. Kill number 5 was another officer, a captain by the insignia on his uniform. He was meeting with 2 other officers behind a stone wall, probably planning their next move. Thornton could only see the top of the captain's head and shoulders above the wall. It was a difficult shot, maybe 155 yards with a narrow target window, but Thornton had been shooting longbows since he was 12 years old. He knew his weapon better than most men knew their own hands. The arrow arced over the wall and came down at a steep angle, hitting the captain in the shoulder and driving downward into his chest cavity. The other 2 officers dove for cover, shouting for medics, for reinforcements, for help that wouldn't come in time. The 6th kill happened on June 13th. A German forward observer was positioned in a church bell tower, calling artillery strikes onto British positions. He was well protected inside a stone structure, barely visible through the narrow tower windows. But Thornton watched him through his binoculars for 20 minutes, noting his pattern of movement. The observer would lean out briefly to scan the battlefield, then duck back inside to relay coordinates over his radio. Thornton waited for the pattern to repeat. When the observer leaned out again, Thornton was ready. The arrow flew 190 yards and went through the tower window like it was guided. The observer fell silent. The artillery strikes stopped. The German battery was blind without its forward observer. Then came the 7th kill, the one that happened in the fog on the morning of June 13th. A German sergeant was organizing a mortar crew, getting them set up to bombard British positions. Thornton was 180 yards away, watching through the mist. The sergeant was animated, aggressive, clearly a veteran who knew his job. He was the kind of NCO who could hold a unit together under pressure, the kind of leader who made green troops effective. Taking him out would hurt German morale and operational effectiveness far more than killing an ordinary soldier. Thornton drew his bow for the 7th time in 3 days. Same motion he'd performed thousands of times in practice. Same anchor point on his cheek. Same smooth release. The arrow flew true through the fog and hit the sergeant's center mass. The German dropped without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. His mortar crew stared at the arrow protruding from their sergeant's chest, then broke and ran. Another German position abandoned because of one arrow. One medieval weapon, one British officer who refused to accept that the old ways didn't work anymore. By June 13th, Thornton had 7 confirmed kills with his longbow. German sergeants and officers, all killed silently, all at ranges between 140 and 200 yards. But more importantly, he'd created chaos in the German chain of command in that entire sector. Officers and NCOs were dying mysteriously. Patrols were reporting medieval weapons. Intelligence officers were filing reports about British archers that their superiors didn't believe. Unit cohesion was breaking down because leaders were scared to expose themselves. The psychological impact was spreading like a virus through the German ranks. The Wehrmacht soldiers in that sector started getting nervous, really nervous. Men were dying without gunshots, without warning. Arrows were appearing in bodies. Medieval weapons were killing modern soldiers in a modern war. It didn't make sense. It violated everything they'd been trained to expect. And fear of the unknown is more powerful than fear of the known. A soldier can steel himself against rifle fire, artillery, even aerial bombardment. But how do you prepare yourself mentally for death by arrow in 1940? You can't. Your mind rejects the possibility even as it's happening. German patrols became more cautious, more hesitant. They started avoiding open ground entirely, clustering in cover, moving faster through exposed areas. Officers stopped standing in visible positions to direct their men. NCOs stopped shouting orders in the open. Entire tactical procedures changed because one British lieutenant was hunting them with a weapon from the 14th century. They were scared of a threat they didn't understand, couldn't predict, and had no training to counter. That's what real psychological warfare looks like. Now, if you've made it this far into the story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Here's why it matters, and I mean this sincerely. YouTube's algorithm decides what to show people based on engagement. Every subscription tells the algorithm that this content is worth sharing. That means more people get to hear these stories about men like Howard Thornton, men who refused to accept that the old ways were obsolete, men who proved that individual courage and unconventional thinking could change the course of a battle. These stories deserve to be remembered. Your subscription helps make sure they don't disappear into history. It takes 2 seconds. Just hit that button. Thank you. The British evacuation from Dunkirk saved 338,000 soldiers between May 26 and June 4, 1940. But not every British unit made it to those beaches. The 51st Highland Division was trapped at Saint-Valery-en-Caux, surrounded by German forces, cut off from the main evacuation. On June 12th, the division surrendered. 10,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war. Howard Thornton was one of them. The Germans marched the captured soldiers east into captivity. Thornton had destroyed his bow before surrendering, breaking the weapon into pieces so the Germans couldn't study it. He still had 3 arrows hidden in his uniform, but without the bow, they were useless. The prisoners were processed at a transit camp near Lille, then loaded onto trains bound for permanent prison camps in Germany and Poland. Thornton ended up at Oflag 7C, a camp for British officers near Laufen in Bavaria. The camp held about 1,200 officers in a converted castle. Conditions were tolerable by prisoner of war standards. The Geneva Convention protected officer prisoners from forced labor. They received Red Cross parcels with food and supplies. They could write letters home, receive mail, organize educational classes and entertainment. But they were still prisoners, locked behind barbed wire, guarded by men with machine guns, thousands of miles from home. Most officers settled into the routine of prison life. They formed committees, organized lectures, put on theatrical performances, did whatever they could to pass the time until the war ended. Howard Thornton had no intention of waiting for the war to end. He started planning his escape the day he arrived at Oflag 7C. Escape from a German prison camp was extraordinarily difficult. The camps were designed specifically to prevent it. Multiple fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers with searchlights and machine guns, regular roll calls to account for every prisoner, patrols with dogs, severe punishment for anyone caught attempting escape, including solitary confinement or execution for repeat offenders. And even if you got out of the camp, you were still in the middle of Germany, hundreds of miles from neutral territory, with no civilian clothes, no money, no identification papers, no knowledge of German. The odds of making it to safety were minimal. Thornton studied those odds and decided he didn't care. He was a soldier. His duty was to escape and return to his unit. He started gathering intelligence about the camp layout, the guard schedules, the fence construction. He recruited other officers who were willing to help. He began stockpiling supplies, civilian clothes made from modified uniforms, food saved from Red Cross parcels, maps drawn from memory, and information gleaned from German newspapers. The castle at Laufen had been built in the 12th century. It had dungeons, secret passages, walls that had been modified and rebuilt over 8 centuries of use. The place was a maze of medieval architecture and modern modifications. The Germans had added barbed wire, searchlights, guard towers, all the modern security features. But beneath all that, the ancient castle remained, with all its hidden spaces and forgotten passages. Thornton and his fellow escape planners discovered that one section of the castle cellar had a drainage system leading under the outer wall. It was part of the original medieval construction, designed to channel water away from the castle foundations. The drain was too small for a man to crawl through, but it could be enlarged. Nobody had thought to seal it properly, because nobody expected prisoners to dig through solid stone in a medieval drainage tunnel. Over 4 months, working only at night, the escape committee dug a tunnel following the drainage route. They worked in absolute silence. Any noise could bring guards running. Any discovery would mean solitary confinement and the end of the escape attempt. They removed dirt, one handful at a time, passing it back through a chain of prisoners, hiding it in the castle's ancient foundations, where nobody would notice fresh soil among centuries-old masonry. They had no proper tools. Everything was improvised. Bed frames were disassembled to provide metal supports. Spoons stolen from the mess hall became digging implements. Table knives were ground against stone until they had sharp edges for cutting through packed earth. Candles saved from Red Cross parcels provided light in the darkness of the tunnel. They shored up the tunnel with wood scavenged from bed frames and floorboards, praying the whole thing wouldn't collapse and bury them alive. The work was exhausting, claustrophobic, terrifying. Men crawled into a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for their shoulders, dug in complete darkness while dirt fell on their heads and their lungs struggled for air. They worked in shifts, one man digging for 20 minutes while others waited, then rotating out because nobody could endure more than that at a time. Some men had panic attacks in the tunnel and had to be dragged out. Others discovered they couldn't handle the enclosed space and dropped out of the escape plan entirely. Thornton worked every shift he could. He was older than most of the prisoners attempting the escape, but he was stronger and more determined. He'd crawl into that tunnel night after night, digging through stone and earth with his bare hands and improvised tools, knowing that discovery meant punishment, but also knowing that staying in camp meant accepting imprisonment. He couldn't accept that. His duty as a British officer was to escape and return to his unit. The duty didn't end just because he was behind barbed wire. The escape committee maintained strict operational security. Only the men directly involved knew about the tunnel. They didn't discuss it during the day. They didn't write about it in letters. They didn't tell friends who weren't part of the plan. The Germans had informants among the prisoners, collaborators who traded information for better treatment. One careless word could destroy months of work. By late August 1941, the tunnel extended 70 feet from the cellar to a point beyond the outer wall. They needed 10 more feet to be safely clear of the castle perimeter, beyond the range of the searchlights and guard towers. 10 more feet to freedom. They pushed harder, working longer shifts, taking more risks. They were so close. On September 3, 1941, exactly 1 year after Britain declared war on Germany, the tunnel was complete. 14 officers were ready to attempt the escape. They would go in groups of 2 or 3, spacing out their departures to avoid raising suspicion during roll call the next morning. Thornton went in the second group with 2 other officers, Captain James Rollins and Lieutenant Peter Ashford. They crawled through 80 feet of muddy tunnel and emerged in a drainage ditch outside the castle walls. It was past midnight. The moon was hidden behind clouds. They could hear German guards talking on the wall above them, completely unaware that 3 British officers were lying in the mud 15 feet below. Thornton's group moved fast once they were clear of the immediate area. Their plan was to walk south toward Switzerland, traveling only at night, avoiding roads and towns, living off stolen food and water from streams. Switzerland was 200 miles away through mountainous terrain. If they could cover 15 miles per night, they could reach the border in 2 weeks. That was the plan. Plans in wartime rarely survive contact with reality. They had civilian clothes made from modified British uniforms. The dye came from ink and coffee grounds mixed with mud. The clothes wouldn't pass close inspection, but from a distance, in darkness, they might fool a casual observer. They had maps drawn from memory and information gleaned from German newspapers over months of careful study. Not accurate maps, but better than nothing. They had a small amount of food saved from Red Cross parcels, hard biscuits, dried meat, chocolate. Enough for maybe 3 days if they were careful. After that, they'd have to steal or forage. The first night went almost perfectly. They covered 17 miles, staying off roads, moving through forests and farmland. They navigated by the stars, heading south toward the Alps. The weather was clear. The moon provided enough light to travel by, and they encountered no German patrols. They found an abandoned hunting lodge in the woods and slept there during the day, taking turns on watch, eating sparingly from their meager supplies. The second night was harder. The terrain became more mountainous. Progress slowed. They could only cover about 12 miles because the slopes were steep and the footing treacherous in darkness. Thornton twisted his ankle on loose rocks, but kept moving because stopping meant getting caught. They found a barn to hide in. During daylight, buried themselves in hay and tried to sleep while farmers worked in the fields nearby. Every sound made them tense. Every voice made them wonder if they'd been discovered. On the third night, exhaustion was setting in. None of them had slept properly for 3 days. They were hungry, thirsty, footsore. Thornton's ankle was swelling badly. Captain Rollins had developed a fever from an infected blister. Lieutenant Ashford was holding up best physically, but the stress was wearing on all of them. They knew the Germans would have discovered the escape by now. There would be alerts at every police station, every checkpoint, every garrison. They were fugitives in enemy territory with no support, no backup plan, and dwindling supplies. They were crossing open farmland near the town of Rosenheim, trying to reach a tree line on the far side of a field, when a dog started barking. Then another. Then lights came on in a farmhouse 200 yards away. A German farmer appeared in his doorway, silhouetted by lamplight, shouting into the darkness. He'd seen something. Movement where there shouldn't be movement. Shadows crossing his field. Thornton and his group ran. There was no point in hiding anymore. They sprinted for the tree line, injured ankles screaming with pain, lungs burning. Behind them, the farmer was still shouting. More lights were coming on. More dogs were barking. The alarm was spreading through the rural community like wildfire. Within minutes, police would be on the way. Within an hour, the entire area would be swarming with searchers. They reached the trees and kept running, crashing through underbrush, making noise, leaving an obvious trail. But stopping meant capture, so they ran anyway. They ran for 20 minutes before Thornton's ankle gave out completely. He collapsed, unable to continue. Rollins and Ashford helped him up, but he couldn't put weight on the leg. They were finished. 3 British officers, 1 injured, all exhausted, being hunted by German police with dogs. There was no escape from this situation. The police found them 30 minutes later. Dogs led them straight to the spot where Thornton and his companions were hiding in a drainage ditch, too tired to run anymore. The police approached with drawn weapons, shouting commands in German. The 3 British officers raised their hands and surrendered. Their escape had lasted 3 days and covered maybe 40 miles. They'd failed, but they'd tried. That mattered. The punishment was 30 days in solitary confinement. Thornton spent a month in a cell, 6 feet by 8 feet, alone, with minimal food, no contact with other prisoners. When he was released back into the general population, the camp commandant warned him that any future escape attempts would result in transfer to a punishment camp where conditions were far harsher. Thornton immediately began planning his next escape. He'd learned valuable lessons from the first attempt. The route to Switzerland was too long, too exposed, too dependent on sustained luck. He needed a different approach. He needed to reach Allied lines faster, which meant going west toward France, where resistance groups might help him reach the coast. And he needed better equipment, better preparation, better intelligence about German security procedures. Over the next year, Thornton participated in 3 more escape attempts. Each one was different. Each one taught him new lessons about what worked and what didn't. The second attempt, in December 1941, involved a tunnel from a different section of the castle. This time they dug from the ground floor, starting in a storage room. The Germans discovered it after 2 weeks when a guard noticed fresh dirt on a prisoner's uniform during a surprise inspection. The entire escape committee spent 3 weeks in solitary confinement. The third attempt, in March 1942, was a wire-cutting operation. The plan was to cut through the perimeter fence during a moonless night and sprint for the surrounding forest. They made it through the first fence before searchlights caught them. Guards opened fire. Nobody was hit, but they were all captured within 100 yards of the wire. Another month in solitary confinement. Another warning from the camp commandant that punishment would only get worse. The fourth attempt, in July 1942, was the one that almost worked. Thornton and 2 other officers, both experienced escapers, had obtained genuine German civilian identification papers through bribery and forgery. They had authentic travel permits that would allow them to take trains toward the Swiss border. They'd been working on this plan for months, building the perfect cover story, gathering the right documents, preparing every detail. They walked out of the camp hidden in a work party that was being sent to repair roads outside the castle. The guards counted the prisoners going out and coming back, but the count was managed by a bribed German corporal who falsified the numbers. Thornton and his companions separated from the work party, changed into civilian clothes hidden in the woods, and walked to the nearest train station. They bought tickets to Munich, using money obtained from sold Red Cross parcels. They boarded the train without incident. For 6 hours they sat in a passenger car with German civilians and soldiers, speaking minimal German, pretending to read newspapers, trying to look like ordinary travelers. Nobody questioned them. Nobody suspected. The plan was working perfectly. They changed trains in Munich, buying new tickets toward the Austrian border. Another 4 hours of travel, still without incident. They were now over 150 miles from the camp. farther than any previous escape attempt had taken them. Switzerland was getting closer. Freedom was becoming real instead of hypothetical. Then their luck ran out in the worst possible way. A Gestapo officer boarded the train at Salzburg, conducting random document checks. He worked his way through the passenger car, examining papers, asking questions. When he reached Thornton's seat, he looked at the identification documents for maybe 10 seconds before asking Thornton to step into the corridor. The game was over. The Gestapo officer had spotted something wrong with the forgery. Maybe the stamp wasn't quite right. Maybe the paper quality was off. Maybe Thornton's German pronunciation had been suspicious. It didn't matter. The officer placed him under arrest. Captain Rawlins and Lieutenant Ashford were arrested moments later. All three were taken off the train, interrogated by the Gestapo for 2 days, then returned to Oflag 7C under armed guard. This time, the punishment was severe. 2 months in solitary confinement, reduced rations, no Red Cross parcels, no letters from home, complete isolation in a cell barely large enough to lie down in. The Germans were trying to break their spirit, trying to convince them that escape was futile, that continued attempts would only bring more suffering. It didn't work. Thornton came out of solitary confinement more determined than ever. He'd proven he could get almost 200 miles from the camp using forged documents. The plan had worked right up until random chance intervened. Next time, he'd refine the forgeries. Next time, he'd avoid trains where Gestapo conducted random checks. Next time, he'd succeed. The 5th attempt, in November 1942, was discovered before it even got started. The Germans found a tunnel entrance in the castle laundry room during a routine search. Thornton hadn't been directly involved in the digging, but he was part of the escape committee that had approved the plan. Another 3 weeks in solitary confinement. By early 1943, the Germans had had enough of Lieutenant Howard Thornton. He was labeled a persistent offender, a security risk, a troublemaker who influenced other prisoners to attempt escape. His file was marked for transfer to a maximum security facility. In March 1943, he was loaded onto a transport truck with other serial escapers and taken to Colditz Castle. Colditz was supposed to be escape-proof. It was built on a cliff overlooking a river valley in Saxony, eastern Germany. The castle had walls 40 feet high made of solid stone. The Germans had installed additional security measures specifically designed to prevent escapes: extra layers of barbed wire, more guard towers, constant surveillance, frequent random searches. Over 300 Allied officers were imprisoned there, most of them serial escapers from other camps. The German commandant, Oberst Edgar Glaische, told new arrivals that Colditz was their final destination. Anyone caught attempting escape would be shot without warning. The British prisoners at Colditz took that as a challenge. They had a saying, "The more escape-proof the camp, the better the challenge." These were men who'd attempted escape from multiple other camps, men who dug tunnels, forged documents, bribed guards, built disguises, tried every conceivable method of getting out. Being told that escape was impossible just made them more creative. Within weeks of his arrival, Thornton was part of an escape committee planning multiple simultaneous breakout attempts. The British prisoners at Colditz had organized themselves with military efficiency. They had a senior British officer who coordinated all escape activities. They had specialists, forgers who created fake documents, tailors who modified uniforms into civilian clothes, engineers who designed tunnel supports and calculated structural weaknesses in the castle walls. They had lookout systems to warn of German searches. They had hiding places for contraband materials. They operated like an intelligence agency inside a prison camp. Thornton was assigned to 2 different projects. The first was the famous glider plan. Two British officers, Flight Lieutenants Bill Goldfinch and Tony Rolt, both former aircraft engineers, had designed a two-man glider that could be built entirely from materials available inside the castle. The idea was audacious to the point of insanity. They would construct the glider in the castle attic, which the Germans rarely inspected because access was difficult. They would launch it from the castle roof, gliding down into the valley below, escaping before German guards could respond. The glider design was remarkably sophisticated. The frame would be built from bed slats carefully removed from bunks throughout the castle. The wing covering would be made from cotton sleeping bag fabric, stretched tight and sealed with a mixture of boiled millet from Red Cross parcels. The control surfaces would use wire stolen from the castle's electrical system. The whole thing would be held together with glue made from flour paste and nails carefully extracted from floorboards. Building the glider required absolute secrecy. The attic space was accessed through a hidden entrance in the chapel ceiling. Work parties went up at night, carrying components piece by piece, assembling the aircraft in total darkness because any light might be visible to guards in the courtyard below. Progress was slow. Every piece had to be crafted by hand with improvised tools. The whole project took over a year of dedicated work by dozens of prisoners working in coordinated shifts. Thornton wasn't involved in the glider construction itself. His role was security. He organized lookout teams to watch for German inspections. He helped coordinate the movement of materials through the castle without arousing suspicion. And he worked on his own separate escape project, a tunnel beneath the chapel. The chapel tunnel was Thornton's specialty. He'd learned tunnel digging at Oflag 7C. He understood the engineering, the security procedures, the risks. This tunnel was more ambitious than anything he'd attempted before. The chapel floor was solid stone. They would have to dig through rock, not just earth. The Germans checked the chapel daily because it was a known escape risk. Any sign of digging would bring immediate discovery. Thornton and his team developed an ingenious system. They removed several stone flagstones from the chapel floor, dug beneath them, then replaced the stones each morning before the German inspections. The excavated rock and dirt was hidden in ceiling spaces and wall cavities throughout the castle. They worked at night using improvised tools, sharpened metal bars, pieces of broken stone, their own hands. Progress was measured in inches per week. The tunnel extended from beneath the chapel floor toward the castle's outer wall. The distance was approximately 80 feet through solid rock and medieval foundations. It was backbreaking work. Men's hands bled from digging through rock. The air in the tunnel was stale and oxygen poor. More than once, a digger passed out from lack of air and had to be dragged out unconscious. But they kept digging. Every night, every inch closer to freedom. By summer 1944, the tunnel was about 60 feet long. They estimated another 3 weeks of work would break through to the outside, but time was running out in a different way. The war situation was changing. Allied forces had landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. The invasion of Europe had begun. The Germans were being pushed back on all fronts. Liberation might be coming. But for prisoners in Colditz, liberation was still hypothetical. The tunnel was concrete. The tunnel was action. The tunnel was something they could control. The Germans discovered the chapel tunnel in August 1944 during a random inspection. A guard noticed that one of the stone flagstones sounded hollow when he walked across it. He stopped, tested it again, heard the same hollow sound. Within minutes, the chapel was full of guards. They pried up the stones and found the tunnel entrance. 4 months of work destroyed in an instant. Thornton and 5 other officers directly involved in the tunnel were arrested immediately. They were interrogated by the Gestapo for 3 days. The Germans wanted to know how many other tunnels existed, how the prisoners obtained tools, who was organizing the escape attempts. The prisoners told them nothing. After 3 days of questioning that stopped just short of torture, they were sentenced to punishment, 1 month in solitary confinement. This was Thornton's 6th time in solitary since becoming a prisoner in 1940. He knew the routine: bare cell, minimal food, no contact with other prisoners, no books, no letters, no Red Cross parcels. Just 4 walls and your own thoughts for 23 hours a day, with 1 hour in a small exercise yard under guard. Solitary confinement breaks some men. It drives others mad. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the endless empty hours with nothing to occupy your mind except fear and doubt. Some prisoners came out of solitary, broken, compliant, ready to accept their captivity and stop fighting. Thornton came out planning his next escape. When he was released back into the general population in September 1944, he found the castle buzzing with news. The war was going badly for Germany. Soviet forces were approaching from the east. American and British armies were pushing through France toward the German border. The Third Reich was collapsing. Some prisoners thought liberation would come within weeks. Others were more pessimistic, believing the Germans might kill all the prisoners rather than let them be liberated. Thornton didn't wait to find out which prediction was correct. Within days of his release from solitary, he learned about yet another tunnel project. This one started from the castle cellars, an area the Germans inspected less frequently because the cellars were massive and mostly empty. A group of French officers had been digging for months, slowly extending a tunnel toward the outer wall. The French invited Thornton to join their escape. They respected his reputation. They knew he'd attempted escape 8 times. They understood he would never stop trying, so they might as well include him in a project that might actually succeed. He joined their team immediately. The final tunnel at Colditz was a masterpiece of engineering and persistence. It ran 60 feet from the cellar to a drainage ditch outside the castle walls. The French officers had been working on it for 6 months, hiding the entrance behind stacked crates, dispersing the excavated dirt through the castle's ancient drainage system, working in absolute silence every night. By October 1944, it was ready. 14 men were selected for the escape, 7 French, 7 British. Thornton was one of the British officers chosen because of his experience, his determination, and his proven ability to survive on the run in enemy territory. They would go in groups of 2, spacing their departures by 30 minutes to reduce the risk of everyone getting caught if one group was discovered. On the night of October 14, 1944, the escape began. The first group crawled through the tunnel at 2200 hours, then the second group at 2230. Thornton and his partner, a French captain named Marcel Dubois, went third at 2300 hours. They crawled through 60 feet of muddy tunnel in complete darkness, emerged in the drainage ditch outside the walls, and immediately headed for the surrounding forest. The plan after exiting the tunnel was simple: get as far from Colditz as possible before morning roll call revealed the escape, scatter in different directions so German search parties couldn't predict which way the escapers had gone, make for Allied lines, which intelligence suggested were now less than 200 miles to the west in France. Thornton and Dubois walked west through the night. They had civilian clothes, forged identification papers, a small amount of German currency, and a hand-drawn map showing major roads and towns. They avoided settlements, stayed off main roads, moved through forests and farmland. The autumn weather was cold but clear. The moon provided enough light to navigate by. For 9 days they walked west. They covered between 15 and 20 miles per day, always moving at night, hiding during daylight. They stole food from farms, potatoes, turnips, apples, whatever they could find. They drank from streams and wells. They slept in barns and abandoned buildings. They had several close calls with German patrols, but managed to avoid capture through luck and careful movement. Thornton's feet were a mass of blisters. He'd lost at least 15 pounds. His civilian clothes were filthy and torn. He had a bad cough from sleeping rough in cold weather. But he kept moving. Every mile west was a mile closer to freedom. Every day that passed without capture was a victory. On October 23rd, 9 days after escaping from Colditz, Thornton and Dubois crossed into territory recently liberated by American forces near the town of Kassel. They spotted American tanks and infantry in defensive positions. They approached carefully, hands raised, shouting in English that they were escaped British and French prisoners of war. The Americans were suspicious at first, 2 ragged men appearing out of nowhere, claiming to be Allied officers. But Thornton convinced them by reciting details about British military organization, regimental histories, the structure of commands that only a genuine officer would know. Dubois did the same in French, proving his identity to the American liaison officers. They were safe. After 4 years, 5 months, and 11 days as a prisoner of war, after 8 escape attempts, after approximately 7 months in solitary confinement, after walking over 180 miles through enemy territory on his final escape, Howard Thornton was free. Thornton arrived in London on November 2nd, 1944. He'd been a prisoner for 4 years and 5 months. He'd attempted escape 8 times. He'd spent over 6 months in solitary confinement as punishment. He'd never stopped trying to get back to the fight. Now he was home, and the war was still going. He immediately requested a combat assignment. The British Army had changed dramatically since 1940. The weapons were more advanced, the tactics more sophisticated, the scale of operations larger than anything Thornton had experienced in France. The entire military had been transformed by 5 years of total war. New technologies, new doctrines, new methods of warfare that would have seemed like science fiction in 1940. But the Army still needed experienced officers, especially ones who'd proven they could survive behind enemy lines, who understood German tactics from years of observation, who knew how to escape and evade capture. Thornton's experience as a prisoner gave him unique insights. He knew how German security worked. He knew their search patterns, their interrogation techniques, their weaknesses. That knowledge was valuable. Thornton was assigned to a commando training unit in Scotland, based at Agincourt Castle in the Highlands. This was where the British trained special forces for operations behind enemy lines. The training was brutal by design. Forced marches carrying full equipment, live fire exercises with real bullets, survival training in the harshest conditions Scotland could offer. The course was designed to simulate the stress and danger of actual combat operations. Men who couldn't handle the pressure were returned to their original units. Thornton's job was to teach escape and evasion techniques to soldiers preparing for operations in occupied Europe. He taught them how to dig tunnels without proper tools, using the same techniques he'd developed in German prison camps. He showed them how to navigate without maps or compasses, using the sun and stars and terrain features. He taught them how to live off the land, foraging for food, finding clean water, surviving in the wilderness with minimal equipment. He taught them how to maintain hope when capture seemed inevitable, when the odds were impossibly bad, when every logical analysis said they should give up. That was perhaps the most important lesson. Physical skills could be learned. Mental toughness had to be built through experience and example. Thornton provided that example. He'd been captured, imprisoned, placed in solitary confinement repeatedly, and he'd never stopped trying to escape. That persistence, that refusal to accept defeat, was what the commandos needed to learn. He also taught them the most important operational lesson he'd learned in 4 years as a prisoner. Never, ever stop trying to escape. The enemy could lock you up, could punish you, could threaten you, but they couldn't break your spirit unless you let them. Every prisoner had a duty to escape if possible, not just for their own freedom, but to tie up enemy resources. Every escape attempt forced the Germans to divert guards, investigators, resources away from the front lines. Even failed escapes had strategic value. The soldiers at Agincourt listened to Thornton with respect bordering on awe. This was a man who'd killed Germans with a medieval longbow, a man who'd attempted escape 8 times from German prison camps, a man who'd walked 180 miles through enemy territory on his final successful escape. When he talked about survival and evasion, men took notes. When he demonstrated techniques, men paid attention. His credentials were written in scars and experience, not in textbooks. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Allies were advancing from the west, crushing the last German resistance in the Rhineland and pushing toward Berlin. The Soviets were advancing from the east, destroying entire German army groups, racing toward the German capital. Hitler was dead, having committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. The war in Europe was clearly ending. German forces began surrendering en masse. Entire divisions laid down their weapons rather than face certain death fighting, a war that was already lost. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. After nearly 6 years of war, after millions of deaths, after the destruction of entire countries, it was finally over. Thornton had spent the final months of the war training soldiers who never saw combat because the enemy surrendered before they could deploy. Part of him was relieved. He didn't want more young men dying in a war that was already won. But another part of him, the warrior part that had defined his identity for 6 years, felt oddly disappointed. The purpose that had driven him since 1939 was gone. The enemy was defeated. The mission was complete. Now what? If you're still with me, I want to ask you for something. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about courage and persistence and the refusal to give up even when the odds are impossible, hit that like button. Here's why it matters. Every like, every comment, every share tells YouTube that these stories are worth preserving, that the men who fought this war deserve to be remembered, that their sacrifices, their determination, their refusal to quit matters to people today. Howard Thornton's story almost disappeared into archives and forgotten records. Your engagement keeps it alive, so please take 2 seconds and hit that like button. It makes a real difference. After the war ended, Thornton faced the same problem as millions of other soldiers. He had to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. He'd spent 6 years in uniform, 4 of them as a prisoner. He was 34 years old. He had no civilian career, no clear path forward, no idea how to transition from soldier to civilian. The Army offered him a permanent commission. He could stay in uniform, train the next generation of soldiers, serve in peacetime garrisons around the world. It was secure employment, a guaranteed pension, the familiar structure of military life. Thornton turned it down. He'd spent 4 years locked in prison camps. The idea of spending the rest of his life in army barracks felt like another form of imprisonment. He took his discharge in 1946 and returned to civilian life in England. He had no job prospects, minimal savings, and a service record that was impressive to military people but meant nothing to civilian employers. The transition from soldier to civilian is hard for anyone. For someone who'd spent 6 years at war, 4 of them as a prisoner, it was nearly impossible. What was he supposed to put on a job application? Killed 7 German soldiers with a medieval longbow wasn't a transferable skill in post-war Britain. escaped from German prison camps 8 times, didn't help you sell insurance or work in an office. Survived 7 months in solitary confinement wasn't relevant to civilian employment. His most valuable experiences, the things that defined who he was, had no place in peacetime society. The post-war British economy was struggling. Rationing continued for years after the war ended. Jobs were scarce. Returning servicemen flooded the labor market, all competing for limited positions. Thornton had been an officer, which meant he'd had a prestigious position in wartime, but no practical civilian skills. Officers didn't learn trades. They learned to lead men in combat. That skill set had exactly 0 civilian applications. Thornton drifted for a while, taking temporary jobs, moving from place to place, unable to settle into normal life. He worked as a security guard at a factory. He worked as a porter at a train station. He took odd jobs doing manual labor, construction work, anything that paid enough to cover rent and food. He wasn't alone in that struggle. Hundreds of thousands of British veterans were experiencing the same thing. They'd spent years in combat or captivity, living on adrenaline and survival instinct. They'd experienced intensity that civilian life could never match. The most important moments of their lives, the times when they'd felt most alive, most purposeful, most necessary, were over. Everything that came after felt hollow by comparison. How do you go back to ordinary life after you've killed men with arrows, escaped from Nazi prison camps, walked through enemy territory for 9 days? How do you care about mundane civilian concerns when you've stared death in the face and refused to blink? Many veterans turned to alcohol to numb the disconnect. Others isolated themselves, unable to relate to people who hadn't shared their experiences. Some committed suicide, unable to find meaning in a world that no longer needed warriors. Thornton avoided those traps, but barely. He struggled with depression, with purposelessness, with the gnawing sense that his best years were behind him and nothing ahead could ever measure up. What saved him was finding work as an outdoor education instructor. A youth organization needed someone to teach archery and survival skills at summer camps. The pay was terrible. The work was seasonal, but it gave him purpose. He could pass on the skills he'd learned, teach young people about self-reliance and determination and never giving up. He could tell stories about the war without dwelling on the trauma. And he could shoot his longbow every day, maintaining the skill that had defined his military career. Working with young people gave Thornton something the military couldn't provide anymore, a sense of building toward the future instead of dwelling on the past. These kids hadn't lived through the war. They didn't carry the trauma, the memories, the weight of what had been done and seen. They were innocent, enthusiastic, eager to learn. Teaching them gave Thornton a way to contribute, to matter, to have value beyond his wartime experiences. Thornton never talked much about his war experiences outside of professional contexts. His family knew he'd been a prisoner, knew he'd escaped multiple times, but he didn't discuss the details. It was too personal, too complicated, too difficult to explain to people who hadn't been there. The men who'd shared those experiences understood without explanation. Everyone else had questions that couldn't be answered in a satisfying way. He married in 1948. He and his wife had 3 children. He worked as an instructor for over 30 years, teaching archery to thousands of students. Some of them went on to become competitive archers. A few represented Britain in international competitions. None of them ever matched what their instructor had accomplished with a longbow in France in June 1940. As the decades passed, the story of the officer who killed Germans with a bow and arrows became something of a legend among British veterans. People who'd served with him told the story to younger soldiers. Military historians who studied unconventional warfare mentioned him in footnotes. But he never sought publicity, never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews about his wartime service. He was a private man who'd done extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, and he saw no reason to brag about it afterward. The British military establishment slowly recognized the value of what Thornton had done. In 1963, a military historian writing about psychological warfare in World War II tracked Thornton down and interviewed him about his use of the longbow. The historian argued that Thornton had demonstrated an important principle. Unconventional weapons could have strategic impact beyond their raw killing power. 7 dead German sergeants wasn't significant from a casualty perspective, but the fear and confusion those deaths created among enemy troops had rippled outward, affecting German tactics and morale across an entire sector. One man with a medieval weapon had influenced the behavior of thousands of enemy soldiers. The Royal Archers Society invited Thornton to give demonstrations at their annual competitions. He showed up in his 60s and 70s, still able to draw a 70-pound bow, still able to hit targets at distances that amazed younger archers. He'd talk about technique, about the physics of arrow flight, about the mental discipline required to make accurate shots under pressure. He never mentioned the war unless someone specifically asked. When they did ask, he kept his answers brief. It worked because they didn't expect it. Fear is a weapon like anything else. By the 1980s, Thornton was one of the last surviving members of the 51st Highland Division who'd been captured at St. Valery. He attended reunions with other veterans, men who'd shared the experience of captivity and survival. They were old men now, grandfathers, retired, living on pensions and memories. But when they got together, they were young again, telling stories about tunnel escapes and forged documents and the elaborate cons they'd run on their German guards. The camaraderie of shared suffering never faded. Howard Thornton died in April 1992 at the age of 81. He passed away quietly at home, surrounded by family. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II and his career as an archery instructor. It didn't mention the longbow kills or the 8 escape attempts or the 180-mile walk through enemy territory. Those details were known only to the people who'd lived through the war with him. His children found his war records after he died. Citations for bravery, records of his time as a prisoner, letters from fellow veterans describing his escape attempts, documents that told a story their father had never fully shared with them. They understood then that the quiet man who'd taught them to shoot arrows in the backyard had been something else entirely during the war. A warrior who'd refused to accept defeat, a man who'd turned an ancient weapon into a modern terror, a soldier who'd attempted escape 8 times because giving up was never an option. The longbow he'd used in France in 1940 was lost to history. He'd destroyed it before surrendering to the Germans, but the principle he'd demonstrated with that weapon lived on. Unconventional thinking wins battles. Psychological warfare matters. Individual courage can change outcomes. The oldest methods sometimes work better than the newest technology. Modern Special Forces units teach those same lessons today. They study historical examples of unconventional warfare, looking for insights that apply to current conflicts. Thornton's story appears in some of those lesson plans, not because killing 7 Germans with arrows was militarily significant, but because of what it represented. One man, surrounded by the chaos of a collapsing army, refused to follow standard procedures. He brought a medieval weapon to a modern war and proved it could work. He scared an entire sector of German troops with a tactic they'd never trained against. He demonstrated that warfare isn't just about technology and firepower, it's about psychology, creativity, and the willingness to try things everyone else says are impossible. The British Army officially stopped issuing longbows to soldiers in 1595. Howard Thornton proved in 1940 that maybe they'd given up on them too soon. Not because bows are superior to rifles in any practical sense, but because in specific circumstances, with the right operator, a medieval weapon could accomplish things modern weapons couldn't. Silent killing at long range, psychological impact beyond the physical casualties, terror created by the inexplicable. The Germans never figured out exactly how many British soldiers were using bows in France in 1940. Intelligence reports mentioned arrows appearing in casualties. Officers questioned prisoners about whether the British had deployed archer units. Some German commanders genuinely believed the British had revived medieval tactics as a deliberate strategy. The truth was simpler and more impressive. It was one man, one weapon, and the absolute conviction that the old ways still worked if you had the skill to use them properly. Now, we're near the end of this story, and I want to make one final request. If you've stayed with me this long, if you've connected with Howard Thornton's refusal to give up, if you've been inspired by his determination to keep fighting even when he was locked behind barbed wire for 4 years, please subscribe to this channel. Not just for this story, but for all the stories like it. The men who fought World War II are almost all gone now. The generation that lived through the war is disappearing. Their stories are fading into history. This channel exists to keep those stories alive, to make sure the sacrifices and the courage and the sheer stubbornness of men like Howard Thornton don't get forgotten. Every subscriber helps us reach more people. Every notification you turn on means you'll see the next story when it comes out. These men deserve to be remembered. Your subscription helps make that happen. So please hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who'd appreciate it. Keep these stories alive. Thank you. Howard Thornton's life after the war was ordinary by design. He'd lived through extraordinary circumstances and had no desire to continue living extraordinarily. He wanted peace, stability, the quiet satisfaction of teaching young people useful skills. He got exactly that. But the story of what he'd done in June 1940 lived on, passed down through generations of British soldiers, studied by military historians, remembered by the few people who understood how remarkable it was. 7 German sergeants killed with a longbow, 8 escape attempts from German prison camps, 180-mile walk through enemy territory to freedom, a life defined by the refusal to accept that anything was impossible. That was Howard Thornton's legacy, not the medals or the commendations or the official recognition, the example he set, the proof that individual determination mattered, the demonstration that courage and creativity could overcome superior force. The officers who called his bow useless were wrong, dead wrong. 7 German sergeants could have testified to that if they'd survived the arrows that killed them. The weapon wasn't useless. The man behind it knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that warfare was as much about psychology as firepower. He proved that fear could be created with silent death from an unexpected source. And he spent the rest of his life teaching anyone who would listen that the old ways, the medieval ways, the methods everyone else had forgotten, still worked if you had the skill and the courage to use them. If you want to honor Howard Thornton's memory, if you want to show respect for the thousands of men like him who refused to quit even when quitting was the sensible option, leave a comment right now. Tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, anywhere in the world. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you've ever heard of Howard Thornton before today. Tell us what this story meant to you. Your comment matters. It builds a community of people who care about these stories, who want to preserve them, who understand that the sacrifices of the World War II generation deserve to be remembered. This channel is more than just videos. It's a community of people dedicated to making sure these stories survive. You're part of that community now. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for helping us keep Howard Thornton's memory alive. The man who proved that a medieval bow could kill German sergeants in 1940, who escaped from prison camps 8 times, who never, ever stopped fighting, deserves to be remembered. You just helped make sure he won't be forgotten.